Welcome everyone, welcome to our clinical spotlight. I'm Tracy Jarvis and I'm the director of PESA UK. We've got a very special guest on today's event, Dr. Kathrin Stauffer. Kathrin is a author, she's a psychotherapist as well as an international trainer. And we're going to be talking emotional neglect and the adult in therapy. So Kathrin, if I could ask you to switch on your camera, and there we go. Hi there.
Hello, Tracy. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's really, really thrilling to be here.
My pleasure. And Kathrin, you've got, well, it's not a new book, actually. It's a book that came out, I think it's was it October, November?
Yes, I guess as books go, it still counts as new-ish.
Newish. And so, let's really go into details about this book. You've obviously done an incredible amount of work, an incredible amount of research. Talk about how common is it in terms of that lack of attunement between adult and child?
That's not an easy question to answer. First of all, you know this thing, when you first discover a new phenomenon, like first time I ever was given some teaching on trauma or teaching on Asperger's or on something like that, you see it everywhere, right? So I now see neglect everywhere. So I'm the worst person to ask in some ways. But let me also say something else. I believe that there isn't a simple answer, because we know from attachment theory that a lack of attunement is to an extent necessary. You know, optimal attunement is not 100% attunement all of the time. Mm-hmm. It's moderate neglect, a little bit of neglect, if you like. So I think whether or not you end up with a clinical presentation of somebody who I call an ignored child, who requires psychotherapy later on and who has significant developmental deficits, will depend on how long for, what age, how bad, you know, is it sense that it might be a bit on and off, yeah. The caregivers might be available at times and not at others. And also, I think quite crucially, does it get repaired? So if there's early neglect, very early, and it's fairly consistent, and there's no repair, the risk increases.
Yeah.
And somewhere there's probably a threshold where something that's just in somebody's background goes across a sort of clinical threshold where it becomes a real struggle for the person later. Or if you like, in terms of a person's real experience, somewhere the neglect gets so bad that the experience is no longer manageable or digestible and becomes overwhelming and traumatic. And actually then you have a person who is even less well functioning the next time it happens and who gets further damaged and so on.
Mm-hmm. So let's go into detail on that. When we talk about damage, we talk about wounding. What are some of the neurobiological impacts of sort of this lack of attunement, this child being ignored? What happens neurobiologically?
I think there are two things that are probably important. One is the damage to a person's affect regulation, a person's self-regulatory system. So, and I think in terms of polyvagal theory, so I would look at the fact that the dorsal vagal system and the sympathetic are more or less present at birth, and the social engagement system isn't.
Yeah.
And the social engagement system is dependent on the presence of a loving and well-attuned carer. So that's going to be the thing that suffers. So you'll have people who basically mostly self-regulate using the sympathetic and the dorsal vagal rather than social engagement system, which means other people are not safe, they're a source of danger. So there's no safety in reaching out to others. That is not available. You don't have shared fun with other people. Yeah, you don't play little games and you laugh, and in the way that you and I are doing, even when we're not physically present with each other, but we're still able to do this just using our faces and eye contact. If you've never had a caregiver who did that early in your life, you won't have it available.
Wow.
And the world becomes an incredibly hostile and dangerous place, really. So these are extreme examples.
Yeah, so that's one. So you mentioned neurobiological polyvagal impact. Was there another one that you wanted to add in?
Well, I think there's something about just the presence of developmental deficits, which means that a person's sense of who they are is quite fragile. And that makes it difficult to change. So, and then, it's a really, unfortunately, really unfair thing that the more damage has been done to somebody's development, the more difficult it's going to be to repair it, and the longer it's going to take to repair it. I think for therapists, it's just important to know that to repair developmental deficits is time consuming. It's not something that happens in 5 sessions.
Yeah. Kathrin, talk a little bit more, maybe give some examples, because we're going to have some people on here are totally new. They might be students. We're going to have people who are maybe counselors and have not gone through psychotherapy training. Then we're going to have your really experienced supervisors and consultants. So just a range of people. Give examples of like developmental deficits. What does that, what do people see in clinic?
So the inability to have fun with somebody else would be is an example.
Yeah, the reaching out.
Yeah, so you don't, when there's any kind of danger, you don't reach out, you withdraw. There may be cognitive deficits. So cognitive deficits in actually believing what the world is like. Or being able to process how to communicate with another person before you have a conversation. It's going to be very difficult. One of the really important ones, I think, is the sense of, if I've never been really attuned to, I will not develop the sense that I'm an agent and I can do something to make things better by engaging with other people. So you can potentially have people who may be very stoic if you're lucky, but if you're unlucky, they may just be very like rabbits in the headlight, and really not feel that they can do anything at all to make things better. They'll have to wait for somebody to come along and make it better for them. I think that's a really important one. So this lack of feeling that I have an ability to, when I'm not okay, I can tell somebody I'm not okay here, and that person will hear me and will respond to that and say, well, can I do something? How about, here's a cup of tea, and have a seat and tell me all about it, or whatever they do, to somehow help you make it better.
Makes a lot of sense. And talk about so we talked about sort of the neurobiology, so those kind of more sort of physical through sort of physical reaching out sort of behavior. Talk about the psychological impact of being ignored, and perhaps how that shows up in the adult. Like, are we looking at a range of different kind of anxiety, depression? Say a little bit more.
Anxiety, depression is common. Certainly anxiety is common. Just because affect regulation is difficult. I would say also one of the ones that I've come across very consistently is a sense that life is hard work. Life is a struggle. Again, that's part of the developmental deficit. It's like you have a child who's having to try and live the life of an adult, but without the physically, obviously, for a child, that would be physically hard work because everything's too big. Yeah, a child is much smaller. And I think psychologically, for people who've really been badly neglected, it feels like that. It feels like everything's too big, everything's too heavy, everything's too much.
Mm-hmm.
Other people are in unmanageable demands.
Yeah.
You know, instead of being a source of having fun or a source of comfort or a source of help, other people make demands, and the demands are very unmanageable.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So these are some of the I think of the obvious psychological effects. There are one slightly specialist one that that I think is also common, is that when you have an attachment relationship where normally you have the caregiver mirror the baby.
Yeah.
And so the baby in some ways sort of leads. It becomes a co-created thing, but basically the caregiver has an availability to mirror what's happening to the baby and respond to what's happening to the baby. If the caregiver doesn't do that, babies need this kind of contact so badly that they'll reverse, so that babies then start to mirror the caregiver. And if that's a very persistent and long-lasting and uninterrupted pattern, what you end up with is a compulsive caregiver. You end up with somebody who, instead of being able to develop who they are, has big chunks of another person inside them. And they may spend the rest of their lives feeling a bit empty and a bit hollow. So this was first described by Lou Cosolino. I feel that important to give him the credit for describing this phenomenon. And he you know, says it's very much about a typical presentation for people who are narcissistic. And I would say it's actually everybody who was parentified develops in this kind of way, so that to actually feel themselves then becomes very difficult. And it's perhaps the reason that my book seems to have struck a chord with at least some colleagues, because many people who are compulsive caregivers become therapists. So it's a fairly typical history for therapists who have been at least a bit neglected. Not everybody, but there's a fairly large cohort.
So let's just break that down a little bit. So you were saying, you know, as Professor Colin Trevarson says, that kind of reciprocal dance, the reciprocal tango, as Sue Johnson would talk about, is really important for, you know, mother, father, baby. But when that doesn't happen and that small child is ignored, that small individual kind of almost goes into the giver role and creates that part of themselves, so they become sort of constant caregivers in a way.
Yes.
And that kind of covers up that wound, that original wound.
Yes, so if you know, you could say it's it's a sort of first line defense for people who are being neglected, and it's a very successful one. Being a compulsive caregiver is hugely successful. It really works until the point where you burn out. It's a very good way of managing distress.
Fascinating.
And like all coping strategies, it comes at a cost.
Yeah.
Which is the absence of a clear sense of self.
Yeah. So I hear what you're sort of, you know, other things that sort of come into that. I was just thinking off the top of my head is sort of, you know, boundaries come into that, because obviously in order to be an adult, you know, I can say yes and I can say no. Yeah. I'm not going to help you.
That's right.
I've got to look after myself today. I've just seen 10 clients. Yeah. But with these sort of, how it sort of manifests is people would not know that boundary, like, you know, when do I need enough time for me?
Yes. Well, just being able to say no. Often, many of my clients would say, I don't have the right to say no. I don't count.
Mm,
What I need doesn't matter.
mm-hmm, 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 mm,
To
mm.
the point where it feels almost like they have the awareness of a slave. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
They're not quite human.
Yeah. And and that sort of right to exist character strategy. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Um, so let's talk about the consequences of this.
Mm-hmm.
So, how might an adult know that they were ignored, that there was sort of this emotional neglect or lack of attunement? Like what kind of show, like what happens?
Yes. I guess one I've already, there's several sort of ways that several things that give pointers. For me at the moment, I would say it's a bit of something to consider when things don't quite add up and there isn't another story to account for. There isn't an abuse story to account for how much somebody is suffering. And this is often a characteristic that people who've been neglected don't know what's gone wrong. They don't have a narrative for what's happened to them. And they don't know why they're struggling with life, why everything seems so hard, and often feel very ashamed, yeah, because they often just assume, well, there must be something wrong with me. And indeed, often have long histories of being blamed. Yeah, you're just not trying, or you're just letting yourself down all the time. Whatever people can say that's really unkind. For these people, is mostly deeply shaming. A very, very all-pervasive shame is typical, and I would say particularly very acute discomfort and shame when somebody is being looked at. That I found that in every single person that I've worked with who has a history of neglect, they really dislike being in the spotlight and being looked at. That's very, very uncomfortable. It makes them feel very exposed. And often there's a real panic response.
Yeah.
Which is horrible, yeah, because not being looked at is exactly the thing that went wrong originally.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like when it happens later in life, it's like this, the traumatic response is so quick that no matter how much you might long to be looked at with loving eyes by another person, you may not be able to bear it. It may be too frightening and overwhelming.
Mm-hmm.
So that is a way that people can, or it gives you a pointer that there's possibly a history of neglect there.
Mm-hmm.
There are, of course, external events where you can make a guess. Yeah, if somebody says their mother was severely depressed after they were born, that's a fair guess, especially if the person says, well, there wasn't anybody else to look after me.
Yes, yes.
So these are obvious ones, or I don't know, parents who had major drug and alcohol issues, who were probably very preoccupied. So parents who are very preoccupied with other things or even with themselves tend to be, tend to neglect their children, or that there wasn't a parent. Yeah.
So you're sort of saying that this is also applicable to, sometimes after birth, there are circumstances that happen, for example, like as you were just talking about, postnatal depression. There can be things happening in families which makes it more difficult, not that it's intentional, but just because of situational things where there's not as much.
I'm so not a fan of blaming parents. Blaming parents may be a therapeutically helpful maneuver at certain points in therapy, but actually I do think on the whole it's good for people to understand that things go wrong in the world a lot without there being anybody to blame.
Yeah.
That's what it is, and it can be difficult with people who've been very neglected, because one of the other things that they all have in common is they're all very, very loyal to their parents. So the attachment relationship they actually form is a very, very strong one, possibly because it is so insecure. and their loyalty is incredibly important. So they all say, oh, it doesn't seem fair to blame my parents. They did their best.
Let's move on to, for this part of our spotlight, I want to move into, you know, the clinical application of working with, you know, adults who were ignored as children. And let's just talk about, we've discussed some of the signs, some of the symptoms. Let's look at that clinical application of, so right, you're the therapist. And for example, I come in and I've been neglected as a child. Where does one start?
Probably for a long time, nowhere. Some therapists would say.
Nowhere. Okay.
There is often quite a long, slow lead in to actually just allowing the client to be with you and to find some kind of way where they're a little bit safe. There can be different things. I remember clients who came and said, I really don't like being looked at. And I'd say, okay, I'll turn my chair around, or, you know, do you want to have a blanket and hide behind that, or something? I just help them to feel a bit safer. So I'll spend a lot of time helping people to feel safe. I've also had clients who, very typically, clients who don't know how to start a session. And so they say nothing. And if you do what many therapists do, which is to sort of be respectful and wait for the client to, you know, say the first thing, they feel punished. Yeah. At that point, somebody's been neglected will already think I'm angry with them. So I've got myself used to not sitting in silence. I usually just allow, you know, I'll say something very, very open, or, you know, how are you, or how was your week? Just something very simple, but just to get the person a little bit going, and to make sure that they know I'm there. I try to be reasonably warm without being invasive. And that's not always easy for me. So, you know, I can err on either side. I can be too stern, or I can be too overpowering or over warm. But that's, I think there's a sort of an attunement where you find the right distance. And I often start with any client probably, but also with neglected clients, by taking history, obviously, feeding back what I understand their history to be, and not just what the history is, but what their experience is. So just trying to give the client a sense that I understand something. I mean, I can't claim I was a seriously neglected child, but I can extrapolate from my experience to have a sense of what it's like. And I will try and communicate what I understand, because I think often that's the easiest way of reaching people who are neglected and who often live in a very, very scary world where it's very difficult to reach them. Mm-hmm. I also remember clients who don't generally feel very, very overwhelmed with the idea that therapy should help them make themselves better, because they can't do that. Yeah. So often they don't know how to do therapy, and often you need to be a little bit more directive with a neglected client than you would normally be. So you can't just expect to follow the client's process, but you may need to say, look, so here's an idea, we could do this. And in my experience, that might make a bit of a difference. So how about we try this? Mm-hmm. So those are some ideas for how to start. It's probably habitual for me to pay attention to how somebody self-regulates. So what somebody does with any kind of arousal in their body, with anxiety, with anger, with feelings that are difficult, just to see, is somebody able to somehow soothe themselves? Do they reach out to me? Are they able to let me help them make it better? Or you know, do they dissociate a bit, or do they dissociate a lot, or what does the person do? And to help people regulate a bit better is, and it, you know, is usually worthwhile, and usually makes people feel quite a bit better initially.
Mm-hmm. With your sort of, I think I'm right in saying this, but sort of specialism in the body, I know you're sort of quite a somatic psychotherapist. You know, Kathrin, do you work sort of with parts of the person, or are you really sort of just tracking that regulation, that affect, when you're working with an individual who's been, you know, emotionally neglected? Are you sort of more working with sort of like polyvagal theory and not necessarily sort of parts of themselves, or you combining it, or how are you working somatically?
I would say I combine, or, you know, I got moved backwards and forwards. I mean, I have been trained as a body psychotherapist, and I have a basic process-oriented philosophy of therapy. So for me to be a bit directive to the client, it is not always something that I do automatically. And quite often the go-to for me is also to just see what does the client bring.
Yeah.
And clients know that I can be easily sidetracked from stuff if they don't want to talk about something. But I will quite often nowadays, I use a sort of ego state approach. I will certainly try and give the client a sense of how their younger selves that got really overwhelmed and really distressed are still in there somewhere. And I think it's often already a very good way of developing a bit more of a sense of self with a client who's got deficits, if I help them create some kind of map of their own mind. So often that's actually a very creative piece of work, to just get a sense of who's in there, who are the different people, what age might they be, what's their experience, how do they feel, what have they got to say for themselves, and work a bit in that way.
Mm-hmm. And so, you know, with regard to sort of creating that missing experience for the client, you as a therapist obviously are, there's a, you know, a part of the person inside, you could look at it like that, that has been ignored, that's been emotionally neglected. So what are some of the things, just from a, you know, recreating that missing experience in a positive light, that you might kind of do instead while you're working with a client over a period of time, to sort of really help heal this younger self and create that better internal attachment from the self to the part that's been neglected?
Yes. I mean, one of the common problems is that, like most people who have been traumatized early in life, there's a very powerful internal persecutor. So these people keep shaming themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'll often do interventions that are aimed to actually heal that internal relationship between, or heal the, if you like, the identification with the perpetrator. There's a very good theory of shame, toxic shame, as an identification with the aggressor, which I think is often very, very helpful for clients. So that's one area to always pay attention to. But I think there's something about just building new resources, opening up new parts of the personality, new things that the person might enjoy doing, new skills, new possibilities in their lives. So this, what I think I'm really learning more and more as I go, is to work in a very resource-oriented way.
Say
Where I'm
more. Say
basically
more.
trying to build more stuff. So where I'm trying to marshal a person's imagination, see what can they do, do they like to write stories, have they got words, or can they have images, or sounds or music, or you know, do we start talking about in books that we've both have read, and he said this is like that bit in Sense and Sensibility where blah de blah, yeah, this kind of thing. And often really helping people to think of things that they might like to do, because it's often things that involve some physical activity, are very good at really creating new bits of self, as it were. So that's, you know, that I think that's very important. And I think anything that stimulates a person's imagination is really important.
And why so? Why so do you say, Kathrin? Is that sort of imagination an important part of this process? Is it because they've not been able to visualize, for example, just, you know, imagine sort of safety, or imagine a future which feels welcoming? Or do you want to say a bit more?
Sometimes, yes, a person has not dared to use their imagination, yeah, or it seemed, I don't know, it seemed that they were setting themselves up for disappointment if they dared to imagine a better life. So often people stop doing that. But actually, just your imagination is easily the most creative bit of you. So if you want to create more of yourself, you need to access a creative part of yourself. And you know, anything can be creative. I mean, as I've said before, if you can create a map of your own mind, that may feel like it's a very thought-based and very intellectual activity, but it's actually also creative. For me, writing a book, even though it's a slight, you know, in some ways slightly boring and scholarly and you know, serious book, but it's also been creative, and for me, as it's full of joy. So that's I think that's a very important area. Another reason that it's important is also that when I do specific trauma work, which I often do using EMDR, I tend to use early trauma approaches to EMDR, and they're all, you have to imagine those, yeah. You have to use your imagination for those, because you don't have a declarative memory. So people have to be able to imagine themselves as a newborn or even as a fetus. And most people enjoy that. So there's something that feels good. Sometimes I do things with clients that are just fun, yeah. That can be a sort of regulatory maneuver, like bringing somebody who's a bit dissociative. We throw cushions at each other until we're both laughing, and then I know the person is back in the room. That works really well. So, and I guess the most important thing then is to just keep an eye on whether what you've suggested to the person or what the person has tried to do has been too much or not. So there needs to be some kind of experience of, yep, this feels good.
Yeah.
I want to do more of this, yeah.
Yeah, so what I hear you saying is that really tracking, as you were talking about earlier, their sort of polyvagal rhythm, you know, is it too much? Obviously overlaying the window of tolerance, so getting them sort of right into that kind of safety okay zone that's not too much and it's not too little, but just sort of right to help build out that window when you're doing these activities.
Yes, I think it's crucial, absolutely crucial. And it's crucial with this particular population of clients, because a classical person who's been neglected, they're not going to tell you when it's too much, because that's what they're used to. They're used to everything being too much. So they're used to just somehow trying to cope, but it's not good for them. It makes them worse. One of the theses that I've got in my book is that the type of trauma, you know, the way neglected people are traumatized is actually not the same way that people who've suffered abuse are traumatized, because it's much more like people who have burned out. I see a lot of similarities between the way somebody who's been neglected early on is in life, and somebody who's burned out, which is really a condition that results from everything just being too much for too long.
Say more about that. Is that because of a hypo response, or once the system's sort of gone up and sort of acting at the edge, that kind of drop after a while, or something else?
I think it's just an overstretching. So I don't know. One of the images I have is trying to throw a stone. And when the first time you throw a stone, you don't throw a very big stone, and you don't throw it very far. And if you keep doing it, your muscles develop, and you can throw bigger stones, and you can throw them farther. A person who's been neglected is like a person who gets given a stone that's far too big for them. So when they're trying to throw it, they're just hurting themselves. Their elbow joint goes, and their muscles start to hurt, and they're pulling their tendons all over the place. And then if they keep trying, it just gets worse and worse, and it creates more and more pain. And that person's not going to get stronger from throwing the stone. So what needs to happen is that they get given a challenge that's much smaller. And I think this is a really crucial concept with people who've been neglected, is this concept of dosing down, which goes back to a Danish colleague, Merete Holm Brandbjerg. She's come up with this idea of dosing down. So you make challenges smaller and smaller and smaller until you reach the felt sense of, yep, this feels good. I got it, I've achieved something, and I want to do more. And that can take you down to very, very tiny little steps. But I think in the long run, it'll still be quicker and more effective than if you're trying to challenge a client, over challenge, to present challenges that are too big, that the person actually really can't handle. And often you have to try it out. You have to get it wrong and see that the person is not getting better, and have the courage to say, okay, let's try a little bit less here.
That's a beautiful analogy that you used of sort of that stone throwing. Talk a little bit about, length of time in therapy. So, for example, obviously things are a spectrum, and there might be other overlaying issues on top of emotional neglect. A lot of the times there always are, because of early trauma. So you see these, but this sounds sort of more like sort of longer term working.
Almost inevitably. I think in the short term, I might offer somebody an early trauma EMDR approach. So trauma approaches, as ever, are the quickest. So you might be able to bring somebody a piece of slightly improved self-regulation by doing that. But otherwise, this is very long-term work, and it's slow work. And I guess some colleagues have said that for them it often feels like, I don't know what person wants from me. I don't know how to help them. I feel very helpless. So you pick up in the countertransference, you pick up the sense that the person actually feels very lost in the world and feels, I don't know how to do this thing life. I just haven't been given the tools. And that can make you feel very de-skilled if you're the therapist. So it takes patience, and it takes probably an ability to just tolerate feeling that you're not being very helpful here. And that your client isn't getting better, or is only getting better at an absolute snail's pace.
Let's spend the last 4 minutes before we go into Q&A talking about, with all your experience, Kathrin, what does success look like? So you've obviously worked with, I don't know, I imagine hundreds of individuals as a psychotherapist, and quite an esteemed psychotherapist as well. So what does that kind of look like from your from your position as a specialist in this area, what does success look like? What will therapists start to see over time, and maybe what does the ending look like, as someone who's had this sort of experience as a child goes out into the world? What does that look like?
Success looks, many. I've had a lot of experiences of success.
Yeah, great.
They're wonderful when they happen, maybe because they're so few and far between. But, like the person who's always just buckled down when the boss even looks at them a bit with slightly knitted eyebrows and doesn't dare say anything, suddenly stands up and says, I don't care, I'll do what I do. Yeah. Tells me about that, and I just think that's wonderful. Or a person who, bigger things, a person who grew up thinking they were stupid and who ends up doing an MA or a PhD. I'm so proud of these clients. And of course, somebody who is proud of them is also an experience that they've probably not had. So ending, it feels like somebody growing up and sort of gradually one day saying, okay, I can do my own now. Yeah, there's often, because these people are so very full of shame, they're often actually very ashamed about having to be in therapy. And those who are very ashamed about having to be in therapy, they will leave when they're able to, yeah, when they feel, right, now I'm big enough to take on the world and stand on my own feet. And then they'll go, and usually go very happily.
And you mentioned sort of some of that kind of, eye contact, specifically around sort of shame, with sort of the ending of sort of therapy and them sort of flourishing. Do you sort of see, more constant eye gaze, more of the capacity to stay actually in a very, yeah.
Yes, typically, yes. And even somebody who can poke fun at me or tell me off when I overstep the mark or something. Those are the big moments. When I haven't got a client who sort of looks to me to tell them what we're going to do and how they feel and what's going to be what, yeah, but actually push back and say, no, I think you've got that wrong, or I think you've got your own confirmation bias here, or what have you. That's wonderful.
So what I hear you saying is that over the course of therapy, with these individuals, therapists need to be tracking those moments right from the start and how they're changing over a period of time, and really celebrating those moments as they change, because you're seeing that kind of change at a systemic level. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, if celebrating seems a good idea. Sometimes celebrating is not a good idea. If there are other dynamics present, yeah, so that celebrating is not safe. But if it's safe to celebrate, yes, by all means, celebrate.
Before we go on to Q&A, is there anything else, or maybe, some core bits or anything else you want to just leave us with before we go into Q&A?
I can't think of anything right now. So I think I've said an awful lot of things. So I'm very happy to go for more, for specific questions.
Okay.
But thank you.
All right.
That was good.
I'm just going to have a look and pick out some questions. So someone says, does emotional neglect always lead to disorganized attachment?
Probably not. I think on the face, most of my clients would look avoidant rather than disorganized. And it isn't until I dig quite a bit deeper that I realized that they'll have most avoidant attachments to most people, with a few exceptions where there will be very strong attachments. I don't know whether that's a definition of disorganized or whether that's just a version of avoidant. It's common, yeah, that if you think of a depressed mother, the mother may not just be unresponsive, she may also be grumpy. So when you have a baby who has not got the safety that comes from a loving and smiley mother, and then she's grumpy, that may feel quite abusive. So there is going to be a lot of experience that isn't just an absence of care, but is actually unfriendly.
Yes. Yeah, yeah. Talk about, there's another question that's come in. Can you say more about why people with emotional neglect are more affected by shame than other categories of abuse trauma?
This is a very interesting question. I don't know the answer.
I was just about to say, if you know that, that's amazing.
I know a few things. I'll tell you what I do know. I know a few things. The most powerful thing I've learned from Colvin Trevarthen, who has these wonderful pictures of young babies who really get into playing with the caregivers. And he has some pictures of babies who reach out and want to play, and then nobody responds. And those and very young, some of these babies are very young. They look so ashamed. It just breaks your heart. So that would be one of the experiences. You try and create a bond and nobody responds. That is an experience that's deeply shaming. Yeah, it's like your social engagement system tries to really go and reach out and do, grow and develop and do its thing, and it just gets rejected, and it sort of falls back on yourself and collapses in on yourself. That's a deeply shaming experience. But that's only one answer. And I think there are a lot of other possible ones which I don't know.
Yeah.
But I'm interested if anyone can think of anything else that helps. Presumably we can say to actually feel that I'm not wanted and not loved means it's shameful, yeah? Means it does mean there's something wrong with me.
It's interesting as you say that, because I think, Sue Johnson says we're wired to attach. We do have a biological imperative to reach out and connect. So if that kind of innate biological necessity is ignored from the start, like you suggesting, besides, pooping and weeing and feeding and kind of reaching out as a baby, that is one of the core things that's done. And if that's ignored, really what you're saying, Kathrin, is that kind of shame and the, I want to say the neurobiological meaning that's made at that time, because obviously cognition is not really online just yet, but that's a massive thing in the body.
It is a massive thing in the body, yes. Yes, and shame may just be the fact that something that wanted to develop has sort of imploded back on itself. That may just be the thing that leaves something that feels like shame. I think it's possible that what neglected people experience isn't actually shame, or can't be made sense of as shame necessarily, but it feels like shame.
Yeah. Because shame sometimes has, again, that sort of social connotation, how it's construed. However, it is social because it becomes the interpersonal interaction in the reaching out.
Yes. Yeah. So I think we can think of a whole epistemology of different levels of shame and different developmental origins of shame, and there are some attempts in the literature that have been done to do this, and I think it's a field that requires a lot more work, because we talk about shame as if it was one thing. I don't for a moment believe that it is one thing. There's very different kinds of shame. So
and also how that kind of response is triggered. Is it through eye contact? Is it through reaching out? Is it through touch? Is it through all sorts of things can be. Yeah. I mean, that's a whole day of just sort of talking about that. We've got 9 minutes left. So, Kathrin, say a little bit about, Ada says, could you expand on how and why the client identifies with the aggressor?
Well, in general, I would assume that it's better than to be the victim. It feels less helpless. Being a victim is basically being very helpless. And that's about as bad as anything can be. So identifying with the aggressor makes you feel less helpless. So, I mean, I'm very good at trying to help my clients unravel this kind of, you're letting yourself down again all the time, kind of internal self-talk. And basically the point is always that, well, if what happened wasn't your fault, then your parents have been at fault. And how scary is that? That's unbearably scary. It's much better to think that it's your own fault, because you can create a world where the bad is all inside and you eat it all down, and the good is outside, and the world is a good place to, potentially a good place to be. And B, it gives you some hope that perhaps you might be able to do something that makes it better. So that's, I would say, to think that to not identify with an abuser is unbearable for most victims.
Okay. Marianne says, can you say something about the relationship between emotional neglect and a person's relationship with tasks or achievement? For example, fear of trying anything.
Mm-hmm. Well, go back to my image with the stone. If you've thrown a stone often enough that's too heavy, and got really done your elbow in, and your muscles are all hurting, you stop trying because it hurts. That's the effect. It's demotivating. I think psychologists have this sort of curve, bell-shaped curve, where if a task's too easy relative to a person's resources, they're not very motivated to do it. And then there's an optimal zone. And then if a task's too difficult for the resources a person has available, they're also not motivated to do it because it's unpleasant. And that's it. It's just that people who are neglected are shifted to one extreme end of that kind of curve, and you need to help them shift back so that they're in the zone, as it were.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Nigel says, can someone who becomes very intellectualized as a person to sort of utilizing the intellect to avoid feelings, mm-hmm. Do you sort of see that as a consequence? I mean, again, that's just sort of a maladaptive sort of coping behavior, but specifically, does it come from, emotional?
It may be. I mean, I think by itself, I wouldn't necessarily assume that this person has been neglected. But it's true that nearly all clients where the main presentation is neglect, the first impression therapists often have is this person is not in touch with their feelings. And I guess I would then add that as a further step, if you then try to put the person in touch with their feelings and that doesn't work, they either leave therapy, or they say I can't do it, or they just don't get better. They try and be nice to you and do it, go through the motions, but don't get better. Then you can start to think about neglect.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let me just Scott, just so for everyone, I'm sorry we can't get to all the questions, so I'm just sort of trying to group questions together to try and answer everyone's.
Well, maybe Claire could also send my email address out. I'm very happy for people to email me if they really have specific questions they want to answer. I can't promise that I'll be able to give them an answer to everything, but
some of these are anonymous, Kathrin, so we're not able to okay. See. have you noticed a link between childhood neglect and adult addiction?
No. Is the short answer. I have clients whose main presentation is neglect who don't seem to have any addictions. Unless you want to call avoidance an addiction, and some have. So I would say there's probably a connection between parental addictions and early childhood neglect. But the child's, if you've had parents who were like alcoholics or whatever, it's quite likely that you'll then grow up not wanting to become addicted, and so you won't. It's often, I would say it's possible that the whole dopamine system and the whole reward system isn't working well enough in the person's brain to make neglected people particularly prone to become addicted. Because I think you need that. You need to have a real sense that you get a little hit from whatever substance you're addicted to, and if that's not really part of your experience, then you probably won't get very addicted to substances.
Mm-hmm. Here's a question, and I think it's a really good question from Sarah Jane. She says, how can you offer any good questions to help track the clients who are struggling to self-regulate and check that the content of the sessions is not too much? For example, I sometimes ask, how were you after last session? Mm-hmm. Do you have any other ways, Kathrin? Or
look at the person. You can tell a lot by looking at somebody's face. If you've done a really good therapy session with a person, regardless of what else has happened in the week, but they'll usually come back and they'll look quite relaxed and sort of clearer in the face will be clearer, and you'll have more of a sense that you can see this person. And if it's not been good, they're quite like, the tissues are quite likely to be a bit puffy and a bit, I don't know, pale and just not look very, I mean, that's one of the things that I sometimes do. I think for most other questions, you'd want to have a good enough relationship, so to be sure that your question isn't going to shame the person. Yeah. So if you say, can you remember something from the last session? I make sure I say, sometimes people can and sometimes they can't. And it doesn't matter whether you can, but just see if you can remember anything, tell me. That often gives you a clue.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Kathrin, just before we end, I mean, this hour has gone incredibly fast. Yeah. I almost can't believe 59 minutes have passed. Is there anything else you just want to sort of leave everyone with, just as a sort of some closing thoughts, reflections before we finish the clinical spotlight for today?
Well, just to say, I slightly bear a torch for people who've been neglected. I think they've also been neglected in the literature. And so my book is meant as a contribution to start people thinking more and developing more resources. I only know a little bit. Yeah, I share what I know, but I think there must be other people out there who also have good ideas about how to work with these clients. And I would love if there is more of a dialogue for that.
Mm. And I second that, Kathrin, because I think there's so much. I mean, I know as a content producer, we have so much content on sort of trauma, whether it's sexual abuse or physical abuse, but we don't have a huge amount on sort of emotional neglect.
Yeah, there isn't.
And so you're right in terms of it sort of being overlooked. So thank you for sort of shining the light on this, and just maybe it's sort of something we could work together on for a workshop or something like that.
I'd love to do more, yes. And thank you very much for having me and for asking such good questions.
Yeah, it's been an absolute delight.
Going, really, so.
It's been an absolute delight. Thank you, Kathrin, and thank you to everyone.
Thank you to everyone as well from me.